Continuing our conversation with Mark Ribowsky, he has this great book, Black Moses, The Hot Buttered Life and Soul of Isaac Hayes. We got disconnected, Mark, and you were in the middle of something that I was very interested in, but it was a few minutes ago, so now I actually kind of forget where we were in the story.
I think I do remember.
Okay, great.
I was talking about how Isaac Hayes was part. What you were mentioning was part of that whole scene where black artists were never paid. And when he started, he never was paid by Jim Stewart at Stax. He was paid by Dave Porter, who was his writing partner, who was making like $50 a week. Right. This was the Smokey Robinson of Stax Record. It was making like $50 a week. It was only when they teamed up as a songwriting team and started having all those hits for Sam and Dave and threatened to leave Stax. In fact, they did leave Stax for a few weeks to start a sub-label with Chips Moman, and who helped found Stax, and then went out and created his own label called American Records in Memphis. They were lured back in by Jim Stewart because Estelle, his sister, said, "You got to have these two guys back there. They're the only guys making hits for us." This is after Booker T and the MGs had sort of cooled off, and Rufus Thomas was sort of had it by then. Carla Thomas had a few hits, but then she kind of receded. They needed those two guys back. But the irony was, even though they were making so many hits, and they were keeping Atlantic there, with them. Atlantic was always seemingly looking for a way to dump out of that deal. But they were sending all their artists to Stax, Wilson Pickett and Sam and Dave, Isaac was never paid well until he became a solo artist. He just never was. He lived in a 2-room flat with the first of his many wives, 4 wives, and his 2 kids. Didn't have a car. He had to bum a ride from Porter and Otis when Otis came in from the ranch, to Memphis. He had no money, man. He was like totally used. It wasn't until he became a star that he rewrote the record book for payments that black producers, musicians, performing artists were getting. Stax, through Al Bell, who had come on, a black guy who had come on. He had been called in by Stax to basically relate to the black artists, because Jim Stewart was basically just a producer and business guy. Al Bell, he basically discovered Isaac as a performer, and he actually gave him an album to do with no notice. Basically, this was called Presenting Isaac Hayes in 1968. He just said, "Isaac, go in the studio, with Duck Dunn, and see what you guys can come up with." He had they didn't combine for any songs or anything. They covered Muddy Waters and Errol Gardner and B.B. King, and it didn't do anything. But if you go back and listen to that Presenting Isaac Hayes, man, that's when soul music grew up, because he didn't just do another soul man. He didn't do another Sam and Dave kind of song, because he could never sing like Sam and Dave. Nobody could.
Yeah.
But he rewrote the book there on how to do black music. He would cover pop songs, and he'd tear them apart to find the soul in them, the R&B, the soul, the jazz. And he put this together on that album. You got to listen to this album. Basically nobody ever did back then. He did it. He was totally drunk when he did it. He and Duck Dunn were totally drunk. They were stoned out, drunk. They said, "Okay, we'll go in the studio. We'll do something." And it wasn't a hit, but Al Bell was such a genius that he wanted to do more work with Isaac as a solo. And he did. And it was from then on, what happened, was history, the 6 gold albums and, Black Moses and Hot Butter, all those great albums. That's when he started becoming paid, and he got that famous or infamous, if you wish, gold Cadillac, that El Dorado, which is
that was one of the things I wanted to make sure that we talked about, because of the fact that you were talking about earlier that he's one of the guys who did start to get paid. And so what does he do? So it's not just a Cadillac
Oh,
Eldorado.
no.
Take a moment to really describe what this thing was. And as I was reading about it, I had made a note that it was usually accompanied by a guard for when he wasn't at the car, because you couldn't just leave that thing parked on the street, could you?
This thing was, I don't know what the final cost was. He put so much into it. It had the windshield wipers were 24 karat gold. Those were the rims on the car. He had an entertainment system in the back before anyone was doing that. TV and stereo. It was gold plated. I mean, the thing must have weighed. It must have been like a Russian tank. It was like gold. They found a place for it in the Stax parking lot, but they had to sequester it from all the others because people would come into the parking lot, take pictures of it, and look and gawk at it. When that thing rolled down the street in Memphis, you knew it was Isaac Hayes. You knew he was in there, and he became like Memphis's. He was the man in Memphis, and people just gawked at this thing. And it's now the centerpiece of the Stax Museum, the museum that was rebuilt a la Motown. On the original grounds of the old movie theater on East Macklemore Street. This is what people come to see, the Isaac Hayes gold-plated Eldorado.
Yeah.
That was,
I want to see
what?
it. I didn't know to take a trip to the Stax Museum the one time I was in Memphis, but for the Eldorado, I would have definitely done it.
But you know what? That was only one of his cars. He had about 9 cars. He was like, Otis did the same thing, Otis Redding. In fact, he sang on it on Tramp with Carla Thomas. He said, I got 4 Cadillacs, I got 4 Mercedes, I got, And this was the template for a guy like Isaac Hayes, who was so poor growing up. He lived in cars. He lived in like old junkers in a junkyard because he had no place to live. He was like 16 or 17. He dropped out of school. He went back to school because his grandmother forced him. His parents were gone. He was brought up by his grandmother. He had nothing. He worked in the cotton fields with his grandfather, but he wanted to be a musician, and he just this was in his head because he could get girls that way. That was his main focus growing up. He wanted to get girls, which he rode to the ultimate limit when he became an adult. I think Booker T told me Isaac would see 6 women at once, and 2 of them were roommates. So,
yeah,
that was when he was filthy rich. I mean, just because Stax was giving him everything, man. They were giving him like every penny. He was making 25% royalties. You know what people get in royalties? 1%, 2%.
Yeah.
I mean, and he was getting more than that because he was getting advances, and he wouldn't have to pay for his sessions because Stax would pay for it. They would give him all kinds of. They paid for homes for him. He had a home in L.A. He had a home in Atlanta. He had a home in Washington D.C. He went to Spain like on a whim, and he would live there for a year. Wow. This was like the ultimate dissipation. I mean,
yeah. See, it's a problem when you don't have the when you're sort of doing this in the era he did. You didn't have the benefit of one being able to watch the MC Hammer Behind the Music about how he lost all of his money, or there was a great ESPN special. This is going back like 10 years. Where Herm Edwards would actually talk to young up and coming NFL players, and he's like, "You know how many cars you need? 1. How many cars can you drive at a time? 1." And he's trying to encourage them to not blow through their money because obviously that money's not guaranteed. And it does seem to be the thing that you hear about so many, once you get some money, it's like, yeah, I think I probably need 9 cars and 6 houses. I understand having a couple of houses, but it's crazy.
There's a big hit. William DeVaughn, diamond in the back, sun rooftop, digging the scene with a gangster lean. That was about a Cadillac. That was about a gold Cadillac. Right. That was the status symbol in Memphis. When Stax started reeling in the money, they all had Cadillacs. It was like a procession of Cadillacs down the street. And yet Al Bell, who was such a brilliant tactician, I mean, he got Stax into movies. He was the reason for Shaft, because he teamed up with MGM Pictures. He had teamed up on pictures before that, approaching that level, on Broadway shows. but he ran the company so badly. Money went through his hands like water. It was he would finance country artists to try to make a Stax, a sort of a country soul label. That didn't work out too well. He started Richard Pryor in the business. He did Jesse Jackson's gold-selling album of speeches that he actually had previewed at the Wattstax Festival in L.A., which was the Black Woodstock in 1972, which was built around Isaac Hayes. But Al Bell blew so much money, I mean, that he just couldn't sustain a company that was actually right there with Motown in the early 70s. Stax started as Motown's stepchild, like a poor cousin.
Yeah.
But whatever Berry Gordy did, Al Bell did just as well. But Berry Gordy never threw away his money, which people who work for Berry Gordy will tell you. I did 3 Motown books.
Sure.
Parting with his money was like, parting with his soul. He never would give it up, which is why he's 93, 94 years old and living large still.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of Motown people, like I did a book on the Temptations. A lot of those guys made nothing, and that's just the way it went in the business. But Al Bell was the reason. He blew so much money. He actually hired a gangster that he gave money to. This is part of the book too. It's a very interesting story. Al Bell, because Stax was being berated and besieged by black racial activists in the 60s, like the Black Panthers, but also Jesse Jackson was trying to put the finger on them too, and he tried to put the finger on Ahmet Ertegun in New York with Jerry Wexler. They were all trying to skim money from Stax. So in order to fight back, Al Bell hired this gangster named Johnny Baylor, who was actually a corner man for Sugar Ray Robinson. He was a very well-respected guy. He had a record company of his own. He owned Luther Ingram, who later went to Stax, another star. But Johnny Baylor was a gangster. He was with the mob in New York, and it turned into a much graver situation for Al Bell to pay him than to pay the Black Panthers, who used to come to the door and give us some money, because he stole money from Stax, which is the last thing Al Bell needed, was to have more money taken out of the till. And he was living in his own mansions and, stealing money left and right. And he eventually got in trouble. The IRS got wind of what Johnny Baylor was doing, took him to trial, convicted him. And from that point on, Stax went because they had no money left to finance acts, least of all Isaac Hayes, who they had to give a release to after all those gold albums. He was, Isaac was just starting. If you look back, he was just getting going after 6 gold albums. He wanted it. He was in movies. He was in Truck Turner and these movies like Escape from New York later. He was in. He's a good actor. And he wanted to parlay that into his career, but he couldn't, because Stax was putting out the soundtracks for those albums, and they went out of business when they couldn't put the soundtrack album out. So everything went south all at once. And guess who owed $6 million in bankruptcy? Isaac Hayes and his wife. Yeah. In 1974, I think. He went totally broke. All those cars meant nothing. They all were put up for auction. People were invited by the IRS and his creditors to come to his mansion and buy whatever they saw.
Right, and he had obviously won an Oscar for Shaft, and he'd given it to his grandmother, right? But at some point, somebody else ends up with that, even
his Oscar is like as well as the cars, like they're like stories in themselves. The long winding roads they took, because in order to, and he had to buy back the Oscar and the car, and had to pay even more for that. And he gave it to his grandmother, Rushia, to keep the Oscar. And then when she died, he gave it to Al Bell, the worst guy in the world to give it to.
Yeah.
So the IRS took possession of that thing and sold it again. I mean, yeah, it was like just he was going through so much crap, and his own very bad investments. This too was Al Bell. Al Bell had gotten an investment firm to be affiliated with Stax, and they told Isaac, we got this great property here. We'll invest it for you, and of course that was a joke. So he lost every cent that he invested, and he was $6 million in debt. This guy who owned the world was $6 million, and he had no place to go. He had signed with ABC Records after Stax gave him his release. It didn't work. The chemistry wasn't right, and so he was sort of like a nomad. This was from like about 76 on through the 80s. There were a lot of years when nobody knew where Isaac Hayes was.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing as I was reading through it. And, as I was reading your book, I started listening to stuff that I had never heard before. Like, he has the Glenn Campbell song, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, I think is the song I'm thinking of. And I know the Glenn Campbell song very well, but listening to what Isaac Hayes would do with a song like that and just sort of like the ramp up, which sometimes, you'll see musicians who do that live, but just, I guess he called them raps. It's not rap the way people think of, but just sort of the conversation that leads into these songs. It's like, it's fascinating to listen to, and just sort of the way that, look, we've all heard covers that completely reinterpret, all along the Watchtower being a pretty good example, but it's so different. And yeah, so as I'm reading the book and as I'm sort of listening to some of this stuff that I've never heard, it does get to that point in the mid 70s where you're just like, oh, it all kind of stops because of bad business, not because, I assume that the albums were still selling well enough that if the record label hadn't gone under, he could have still, so he really kind of isn't a part of disco, right? Because he's sort of like without a home. It's a little bit, but he doesn't put out a lot of albums in the late 70s, right?
That was sort of walking on eggshells for him, and Bill Withers had to do it too. Yeah. Because disco took over the culture so intensely. You had to get into the disco market. And let's face it,
even the Rolling Stones and Kiss had to put out disco songs, so yeah.
Bee Gees, you had to get into, the Four Seasons reunited to do a disco song. What the hell's that? I grew up with those guys doing, Ragdoll and, Walk Like a Man. And all of a sudden, I was in there walking like, John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. Right. But it's funny you say that, you mentioned these covers that he did of these pop songs. Burt Bacharach songs and Jimmy Webb songs. He tore them apart. He just made new songs out of them. And those covers I was telling you about before, the samples, there are a lot done of those. Walk On By and By the Time I Get to Phoenix, but in his iterations of them, not Glenn Campbell or Dionne Warwick, who basically also he wrote a hit song Deja Vu later in the 80s when he got together with her for like a one shot thing. But he got into disco, but it's very interesting listening to his disco songs because his disco songs are almost like a protest against the disco songs. They were like, almost parodies. Later on, he put out a disco album that was entirely a parody. And there was a video he did about disco that was a parody. I think that was his way of saying, I'm going to, try to meld into this culture. But don't take it too seriously because I don't. But let's face it, Shaft is a disco song. You got the wah-wah guitar, you got the 16th notes on the hi-hat, but played by Willie Hall. You got the Skip Pitts guitar, the wah-wah, and those were elements of, and this is before disco really hit, like 71, Shaft. Yeah. This is before it hit. This is the elements that the disco artists used. They used a lot of that stuff in Philly, the Gamble and Huff crowd in Philly International, when they put together their own band, the MFSB Orchestra, and they used it. Basically, they copied Hayes' stuff, the way he put together that because all of his songs were danceable. That goes without saying. he didn't do like ballads that you would do a waltz to. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He was all get up and dance. So he had a great influence on it, which is why they copied sampled so much of it. But he never got into disco, and there's not really an Isaac Hayes disco song that I would recommend anybody listen to. I would recommend rather that they listen to Presenting Isaac Hayes than that. Where he's covering Misty.
Right, and that's the first one that you referenced earlier.
Yeah, the one they did totally drunk when they sent him into the studio with Doug John and said, "Let's have an album." I love that. I love that album. And
yeah. I want to talk about Shaft for a moment because I had a fascination with Shaft in the early 90s because of the fact that as you mentioned in the book, it's not a particularly good movie, but with that music, I can't imagine what that movie would be like if it just had, some generic songs from 1971, if it didn't have that score and that song. I mean, the sequence where Richard Roundtree's walking through, a Times Square of a very different era, and just set to that music. And it's fascinating. I actually showed it in a film class when I was in college because we were trying to make a point of, just things that writing, that a script could never actually convey. And here, look at this sequence. And it's it's just like the music makes that, like the guy trying to sell him a watch. I haven't seen it in years, and so much of it sticks with me because it's just, and it really sets the tone for this guy is really cool. And then, the story in and of itself is fine, but what do you think Isaac felt about his legacy, about that movie? And was it business that he didn't want to do the sequels, or because you feel like he could have used the money from what you're saying to do Shaft's big score and Shaft in Africa, but
at that point he didn't need it because he was being given money to do scores for other movies. I thought that was a great great thing to do on his part, to reject easy money like that.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have gone into Shaft in Africa, as you say, Shaft down the street, Shaft at the tailors. I mean, he could have done any of those things. He never did. He just never wanted to copy himself. He wanted to keep moving forward. Until later on, one of the last things in his life was when he did, when they used Shaft music in Shaft 80 or Shaft 90.
Well, they did because they did the Sam Jackson Shaft 2000 is the official name of that. And then reading your book, I'm like, I forgot that there was a Netflix Shaft in 2015 or something. I actually didn't even remember that.
A lot of people forgot that.
I'd gotten Shaft out of my system by 2015. I had kids. I didn't have time to, keep track of.
Well, what shocked me? He could have done Superfly. He was offered Superfly by Gordon Parks, who produced and directed Shaft.
Right.
He wanted Isaac Hayes to do what Curtis Mayfield did, and by not doing it, he opened the door to Curtis Mayfield. And it's those two albums. They're just like 1 and 1A.
Yeah.
That was soul music that everybody wanted to do in 1971, 72. But right, he never did. The only remake, I wouldn't even call it a remake. I call it like an add-on or something that was ever done was by the Bar-Kays, who did a song called Son of Shaft in 1973, which made no sense because Shaft would have been just 2 years older than he was, and when he had the original movie, and I don't know, and they didn't credit Isaac on that, and Isaac used to take the Bar-Kays on tour a lot. He used to he produced albums for them, and they did this Son of Shaft, which was, I don't know if you ever heard it. It's just a disaster. It's basically the same beat, but with crazy lyrics about Shaft's son growing up and being a crime fighter, and it's just an abomination. And he could have done that himself. He could have done Son of Shaft, but he never did. I think it's great. The last Shaft movie, the last one in the series, and I hope it's the last one ever, they actually used the original Shaft at the end. Remember when they were walking through by Grand Central Station, the three of them?
Yeah.
Richard Roundtree and Samuel Jackson and the other one,
New one, yeah.
Striding through it the way Richard Roundtree did, as you described, at Times Square, one of the great opening scenes in movie history.
Yeah.
And it just, that's the only time you actually felt something for that movie, the last movie. I don't even know, what was it called? Son of Shaft's son? I mean, Son of Shaft's grandson, whatever, you know. That was the only time you actually felt the original, you know, the bang of the original Shaft. I still hear that song, and it's 50 years, man. It's 50 years, 51 years. I still hear that song, and I gotta hear it all the way through. It's just
Yeah,
something about it. It's just
I
something.
definitely agree with that.
And he
Yeah,
added
for
those
sure.
lyrics to win an Oscar, you know. The lyrics, you want to call them lyrics, the garrulous lines at the end of the song, you know. It was bad mother and, you know,
Yeah.
shut your
Well,
mouth, you know.
yeah, and I love the sort of the basically a footnote, but that the actress Thelma Hopkins
Yeah,
basically built a
that's right.
career out of having said "shut your mouth." You know, she was on like Bosom Buddies and a bunch of other shows
You
because it
you
was
are
like,
right.
hey, yeah.
You are correct.
So, and it was like, I don't think I ever knew that that was her, and
That was
you
her.
know,
Yeah.
so it what as you look at Isaac Hayes, you know, his career as a whole, I think it's important to talk about, you know, yes, he had all this money coming in. And it seems like, you know, he might have had a couple of bad people in his ear. I'm talking pre Scientology, but he was very well intentioned in terms of the activism and the amount of charity
Yeah.
performances he would do and things like that. I mean, you mentioned he had a home in Washington, D.C. So the understanding is that that was because of just how involved he actually was. Instead of saying, you know, instead of just throwing money at it, he actually seemed to really be invested.
True. Yeah. Actually, I should probably append that he too fell in with Johnny Baylor, and that cost him money too, because he bought all of Johnny's BS, you know, and that
Oh,
he
sure.
had a falling out with Dave Porter, which can hardly be believed, you know, because they were so close and wrote so many great songs. Um, he bought into the fact that he was better than anybody else at Stax, and that was the curse. That was the kiss of death for him, you know. But he did have that place in Washington, and he had a place in L.A. because he had to be in L.A. I mean, he had to have a place in L.A. And he actually married his third wife there, Mignon, out there, after recording his Live in Las Vegas album, another album that everyone should listen to. It's an astounding live album. You know, it's like Bill Withers' album at the Carnegie Hall. It's like a must-have album. Well, all covers, a few originals, but mostly all covers. And he was still doing what he was doing, you know, with Hot Buttered Soul, taking these great soul songs. And he knew a great song when he heard it. He was a student of music. So that's why he loved Burt Bacharach and he loved Jimmy Webb. And he loved the great songwriters because he knew it opened up fertile territory for himself too. And he was still doing that with that Live in Vegas album. But that was when he hit the skids, you know, financially. The movie thing didn't really pan out. And what I said before, for like a decade and a half, he was sort of like a missing person. And I think he lived in Europe for quite a while. He lived in Europe for a few years. And Duck Dunn was very pissed off at it because they were going to go back. After the Blues Brothers did Soul Man, they were going to get together the original musicians who, you know, were with Isaac in the early Stax years. You know, the Booker T and the MGs. You know, Steve Cropper and that gang. And they were going to go tour as the Soul Men, the original
Yeah.
Soul Men. What a great idea, right? But they couldn't find Isaac. What a great idea! Here we are, the original Soul Men. You know, because by then they were all Hall of Fame. I mean, material. All those guys. It's that Al Jackson Jr. You know, who unfortunately was murdered in a very unfortunate, sidebar there. But they couldn't find Ike. They just couldn't find him. He was going through a lot of men. There were rumors that, you know, the CIA had gotten to him, that he was like on a secret mission somewhere, or he was a drug runner, you know, because they couldn't find him. They didn't. His own children didn't know where he was. Which is why he was sent to jail for a little while for not paying child support. He was a man, and he was just lost. He was a man who was lost
because of the bad contracts that you referenced earlier. When the Blues Brothers have that hit with Soul Man, does he not get any financial gain from that? Because basically he just didn't really see any of that, right?
He got there was an arrangement made for that, because that that was the whole thing where they had to go through not only Atlantic to get the rights to it. They had to get the TV permissions and stuff. I
Right,
think
sure.
they cut a little bit of a royalty deal with him. Through the years, he would get these little perks. The people who owned Atlantic was Sony, but it was a giant corporation eventually. They did give him back a few of his rights, but he
Oh,
never got.
okay.
In fact, when he gave his speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the theme of his speech was how he was screwed, and I don't blame him, because he's standing there with hundreds of people who are like filthy rich in the industry, drinking their martinis at the tables, in their
Yeah.
tuxedos, and here he is, doesn't even own rights to Shaft. I mean, the hell is that about? That was, and that wasn't even Atlantic. That was after Atlantic, when Paramount and Gulf and Western owned it. There were so many people who took advantage of him and Stax that it's just incredible. So
Yeah, I
he
did notice
never,
yeah, there's like a timeline of like different corporations taking advantage of the different bad deals that had been made. Yeah.
it's not, but he did get back some, the way Bill Withers, well, and got back some through Michael Jackson, actually. But no, he never got back what he really deserved, and he always was bitter. But he made enough. He can't be. He had that little period there with Dionne Warwick, and he would do TV, did a lot of TV shows, the Rockford Files, the A Team. He and Mr. T. What a pair, right? And probably one of the
Yeah.
greatest moments in that show's history.
You do reference that in the book, and that's sort
Yeah.
of like in the notes I made was look for the episode of the A Team with Isaac Hayes, because I want to see him and Mr. T
Oh, they have
interacting together.
great conversation. It's like, they got them right. The writers got it correctly. So and then he did a duet with Barry White, which people wanted him to do in 1974, and he
Yeah.
refused, because both of those guys refused that. They thought they were better than the other guy. But that's how, and Barry had fallen on hard times as well, so they had to do that, and it wasn't a big hit. It's called Dark and Lovely.
Yeah,
And
I was reading that. It's surprising that you're right.
it
They
didn't
definitely
work.
didn't do it at the right moment. If they had done it, in the 70s, that would have been something. So, as you're sort of looking, as I was saying, when you put the whole book together, you're able to really examine his whole career. What do you think the legacy of Isaac Hayes is? I mean, there's individual things that you can point to. You can point to the highs. And, as I said, I knew him from Shaft and South Park predominantly. And so that's why I appreciated filling in a lot of these details. But as you look at him sort of career-wise as a whole, what did you feel like is the legacy of like, well, I'm glad I wrote this book because this is what people should really know
Yeah.
about this guy?
Yeah. As I said before, I really consider him the leading edge of when soul became mainstream. Soul was great in the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of great records, but they were offshoots of the main industry, which is why they never could get a nomination for the popular music awards at the Grammys. There was always an R&B. He changed that. When he won his Oscar, man, he changed everything. I mean, he was only the third African American to win an Oscar and the first music guy to win an Oscar. It had been Sidney Poitier and Hattie McDaniel before that, and so, and I put it in the book because I really enjoyed it. The performance he did of Shaft at the Oscars in 1972, when he actually opened the show. Sammy Davis brought him on, and he did this thing that nobody had ever seen at an Oscar before. They were wiggling and jiggling in the disco costumes and all that. And there's Isaac with the chains and the bare chest, and he did Shaft. And I love that moment because you could actually point to that as one of the moments when black music became mainstream music, and everybody wanted to sound black. We were talking before about, the Bee Gees and all these,
Sure,
groups that try to sound black. There were tons of them. And I really give him credit because he did something nobody else did. There were tremendous. I mean, Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder alone are, worthy of that honor if you want to credit them with that. But what Isaac did was he took music into a direction nobody had ever taken it before. He took pop songs and he made them soul songs. And not only that, he pioneered rap, which you said before was true. He didn't consider rap in the way it's considered now, because he didn't go through a whole song of rap. It would be integrated into the song as a mood changer. He called it Ike's moods. He would tack on to a pop song a little tidbit called Ike's Mood 1, Ike's Mood 2, and that would carry on through the albums. And he would talk about his life. He would talk about his divorces, talk about his cheating. Yeah. He would be proud of it one song, and then he would say, there was another song called I Apologize, where he apologized for all the adultery in his life. So he would go from like mood to mood to mood, and you have to it's sort of almost like Pink Floyd. You have to listen to the whole album to understand where he's coming from. Like one song would end, and the next one would pick up where he left off, and you'd have to follow along, and that's what he was saying. And nobody had ever done that in soul music before. Soul music was basically a dance groove, torch songs, emotional. Excellent, I mean, Ike and Tina Turner. I mean, who could be better than that when they were making their R&B in the 50s and early 60s? But what Ike did, nobody did then, and nobody's done since. I mean, so if somebody wants to argue with me, tell me how somebody has done what it has. Even though they've sampled him, they've not nailed the moods, the many moods of Ike.
No, and I think that was the interesting thing as I listened to a lot of these, a lot of these covers that he would do, that he would really take songs that, you think of a certain way. A good example would be You've Lost That Loving Feeling, and even Summer in the City, which seems like it was a little bit later, but it's like you just don't think of them, and like taking the time to put a personal stamp on it is pretty great. And I've got a.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, I didn't even know he had covered Use Me, the Bill Withers song. I didn't even know that until I wrote the book.
Right.
So he would reach out all over, for a great song.
No, so there's so much, as I said, to listen to. It's not just that I want to see a scene with him and Mr. T on the A-Team. There's so much that I'm like, I hadn't heard much of this. So if nothing else, for me, it's like I got a little bit of an insight to the two things I did know. And as I said when I first started talking to you, that I really did not understand the end of the South Park situation until I read your book. So I was like, I was really glad that I had a better handle on it. But just so much of his career, and I just wasn't aware of it. So that's why I hope that people take the time to read Black Moses, The Hot Buttered Life and Soul of Isaac Hayes. We've been talking to Mark Ribowsky. Now, you said Bill Withers is up next.
Next year, probably. Sometime next year. I'll see you then.
I look forward to.
That's a story. That's a great story too, of a guy who just walked away from the business. That's a great story.
Yeah,
a lot of badness about the industry there too.
A lot of us can't understand sometimes those stories of people who walk away from the business, or people whose careers could have gone in a different direction. Like Dave Chappelle leaving $50 million on the table because he didn't want to do Chappelle's show anymore. So I mean, it's you have all these things that are like, oh wow, okay, so money is very important, but you do have those people who are like, you know what, I don't need any more of it, I've got enough. I'd
like to do. I may do a book on Bobby Womack, and you talk about somebody who was screwed, but also left a mark on the business. These are guys who are just sort of ignored now. This is where we started this interview.
Yeah,
these are guys who are ignored now, and that's a crime. That's a real crime. I mean, they were given their due late in life. They made, the Hall of Fame, and when they died, they certainly were revered. But you're talking about people who shaped an industry, and it's my theory that there would never have been a civil rights movement without music to back it up. I always go back to when Martin Luther King did his March on Washington in 1963. The number one song in the country was Stevie Wonder's Fingertips Part 1. And I always made that connection because they were singing it at the march. I always made the connection that there had to be a background feel provided by popular music for any movement to succeed. And if you look at the civil rights movement, I mean, Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis. Isaac was going to meet him that very day because he was at the Lorraine Motel, which is where Stax sent its writers to go to get away from the theater, that atmosphere, and be, just surround themselves with their own thoughts in a room at the Lorraine Motel. And when Martin Luther King was killed, Isaac Hayes couldn't write for a year. He had writer's block. That's how invested he was in the movement. When there were riots on the streets in Memphis after the assassination, Isaac Hayes came out alone without bodyguards and would try to get the gangs off the streets because he knew the white cops were out there waiting to bust them and worse. The cops come into the Stax parking lot and arrest the black performers and leave Duck Dunn and Steve Cropper alone. You talk about Memphis in the 60s. It was a horrible place for African Americans,
Yeah,
It's not much better today, by the way. And
and specifically reading in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination, I remember reading in the book, it was like very clear that Isaac was out there saying they're just looking for an excuse to arrest you or worse.
And he was in great danger himself, but he put on a concert. That was the mayor and the police chief all tried to put the kibosh on, but he saw it through. That was Isaac. When he had it in his mind to do something, he would do it. And that includes music, because when he got Soul Man in his head watching on TV the Detroit riots in '67, he turned the tragedy into a great achievement for race and for black performers, and because he got it in his head, he wanted to do that, and he had a way of doing it. He would just go in the studio with an idea, never really a complete sheet of music. And he would just sit down at the piano and start. And Sam and Dave hated him for that, especially Sam Moore. I mean, Sam hated it. He puts us through all this crap. We just want to go in and sing. And yet later on, he said after they left Stax, they never had a hit again. And they said, we really miss Isaac Hayes.
I thought that was, because in the early part of the book, it is, I think you're right. Obviously, you're right. Sam in particular was really, how he felt about him, but they clearly they appreciated what he sort of put them through, and you hear that a lot, bands that start out, any kind of performer that starts out, the producer that really puts them through the ringer, and, they hate, the Eddie Kramers and the Bob Ezrins, but they then end up putting out like their best albums. And they were like, oh yeah, we actually needed that at that point in our career. So it's,
he let them sing too. He didn't go in with, at Stax, they didn't do the adding the vocals later because they weren't working with a lot of tracks, and they wanted the live feel anyway. The studio there with the low ceiling and the big curtains, because it was a movie theater, made the sound so perfect. They used the bathroom as an echo chamber, but they would just say, sing with the music. We don't want you to put it on later with you wearing headphones. We want you to sing as you would in a club. And that's why Sam and Dave came through. So, I mean, you could feel every syllable. And Wilson Pickett, you could really feel that graze of soul, And he let them do that. He was a brilliant producer, writer, and performer. And I hope the book gives him some due. I hope he gets some due from it because he deserves it.
Yeah, no, he definitely deserves it. And, it's even someone who had, a very casual, limited understanding of him, just able to sit down and just really come away with a greater appreciation. So hopefully that is what happens to everybody who takes the time to pick out the book. And I'll mention one more time, Black Moses, The Hot Buttered Life and Soul of Isaac Hayes. Mark Ribowsky, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really enjoyed the conversation. And as you said, I look forward to talking Bill Withers with you sometime next year.
That'd be great. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks again.